Good evening. It's September 20th, 2013. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I'd like to welcome you to our live webcast tonight on LaRouchePack.com. As usual, on these Friday night events, we will be featuring Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, and we will be posing a series of questions which Mr. LaRouche will have his responses to. Now, I'm joined in the studio tonight by Megan Beets of the LaRouche Pack Scientific Research Team, The Basement, and she will be joining me to pose the questions to Mr. LaRouche tonight. And I would like to ask Megan to come to the podium to pose our first question.
Thank you. The first question comes to us from an institutional contact in Washington, D.C., and the question is on the economic crisis in Europe. They say, Mr. LaRouche, with all of the recent focus on the Middle East, the ongoing economic crisis in Europe has tended to be forgotten. Yet, Greece, to take one example, is going through a continuing collapse with 6 consecutive years of economic decline despite 2 bailouts. According to some accounts, the Greek unemployment rate is the highest in recorded European history. Spain, Portugal, and other European nations are not far behind Greece in the collapse process. Now it appears almost certain that Greece will need a 3rd bailout very soon. Clearly, the policy of bailouts conditioned on austerity is not working. What is the alternative for Europe? How does the fight that you have led for Glass-Steagall in the United States, which has gained tremendous momentum in the past few weeks, relate to the European situation?
Well, there's some things you have to take into account, and these are not restricted to Europe. They are international. But the difference is the difference in the situation in the United States from that of Europe. The problem is centered, of this type that we're dealing with, is centered in the British oligarchy, in the British system, which is actually the Anglo-Dutch system. And this is a global system, which we can count at least not less than 40% of the total activity, of personal activity, of people on the planet. And actually, if you want to draw the conclusions, which are more complicated, you can extend that to 60% and so forth of the total planet. So what you're dealing with has a simple solution. Most of the problem is that, first of all, people are not producing anymore, or they are producing on a much reduced scale. They're not really producing anything to speak of. So the actual of the total amount of so-called dollar equivalent income passing through the system is increasingly large in respect to money, but is shrinking at an accelerating rate in terms of reality. If you may have noticed that in recent years, you have a hyperinflation throughout the transatlantic region. Just think of prices when you go back to, say, take 1960. And you can, and what's happened in the more recent thing under the Bush and Obama. Under Bush and Obama, we've seen in the United States the greatest collapse of income per capita in all recent history. This is a hyperinflationary thing which is killing people, and it tends to kill people. Now, the root of this thing starts from several things. First of all, it starts from the way the banking systems operate. Now, banking systems like the Wall Street system or the equivalent British system really are not banks. They're thieving operations. The complication is not only are they stealing, like Wall Street steals. That's what it does. It steals. It doesn't earn anything. Look at the recent hyperinflation that started again and even shocked some of the people who've been pushing the hyperinflation before. So the problem is you're dealing with a hyperinflationary situation. Now, if we were, say, we apply Glass-Steagall, we would shut down and foreclose banking systems such as the Wall Street system and the equivalent European systems. We'd close them down because all we have to do is call them in for an accounting and say, well, you've had this debt that you call debt. You've had this kicking around over there for a long time. You've never liquidated it. In other words, you are simply speculating, playing the game of boardwalk in monopoly. And so the game goes up, the prices go up, the money flows, the income, reality collapses. So therefore there's a good side to this, or beautiful side to which we say. The beautiful side, if we do the right thing, and if we put through Glass-Steagall, we will just automatically liquidate most of Wall Street and similar kind of institutions in Europe. You see, in Switzerland, for example, in the Swiss banks are now causing a crisis feeling throughout much of Europe, because the Swiss big banks, now one of them at least, is going back to reality, or toward reality. And that is a threat to everybody, because they're not going to, they're kicking out. They're not going to go with this anymore. They know they can't survive it. Now, the Swiss economy and the Swiss society is different. The way they react is different than the rest of Europe. So if we put through Glass-Steagall effectively, as it now seems a feasible proposition, this is not something that might happen by magic. This is something which would be a natural thing to happen. In other words, it's come to that point. Wall Street and the similar kind of clowns really don't have much grip on anything anymore. All they have is gangster muscle, and you're going to find more of it. But if we put through Glass-Steagall, and we're getting on the edge of putting through Glass-Steagall, and putting Glass-Steagall in will have a lot of implications, which will be wonderful. Not perfect, but wonderful nonetheless. Because we will actually be forced to foreclose on Wall Street and similar institutions and practices in Europe and so elsewhere. Now that means that the burden on the population of the United States and Europe, for example, will collapse. Because if we put into Glass-Steagall, the system of the national system will be based on Glass-Steagall and on the institutions that go together with Glass-Steagall. So that we will cut those things off. They're not on the agenda, because we're going to issue a credit system, and most of the income that is going to be circulating in society is going to be the income that we do on the basis of a credit system. Just exactly what Alexander Hamilton prescribed in his day. So the idea of this terrible debt, it can be wiped out. Not in really entirely, but if we shift so we don't no longer borrow or take credit in the swindling system, and you go back to a real system, which is Glass-Steagall, you will automatically have a fundamental shock-like change in the situation for the betterment of the people. It will not be perfect because other things have to be done, but we can have a very sudden point where this hyperinflation, we blow it out. How? We bankrupt them, because they're not worth anything. They're using the control over their political control. Now, the other side of this is the force behind this, typified by the British monarchy. Now, the British monarchy is not the British monarchy, it's the Anglo-Dutch monarchy. It's a worldwide empire, which is the dominant empire on the planet, is the Anglo-Dutch system of empire. And even though gave them the credit for the modest 40% of world income, they actually are larger in terms of the gambling. But we shut them down because we changed the system. What we've done, we've destroyed the real economy for the sake of the speculative economy, which produces almost nothing. For example, when the auto industry was shut down in the United States, and essentially shipped out to China and so forth. What happened? That was the end of real productivity. And when similar things happened in agriculture. So there you take the big centers in industrial production and similar related kinds of production, and then agriculture you're putting down. What's left of your economy? So therefore, what we're in to deal with is not worrying about how this terrible thing is going to hurt us in terms of a hyperinflation. We can deal with a hyperinflation. We have to make the political decisions in government which cause us to dump the swindlers and put them out of business, or mercy something or other, and we simply will change things. We will cancel prices. You think if we cancel, as what we should, in terms of London, France, and Wall Street in the United States alone, do you realize how much of that stuff will just be wiped out? Now, what would be the effect of wiping out all those debts? The debts assigned to the people will collapse. That will actually tend to import growth. Because if you're forcing this system, you're going to find things like simple foodstuffs and so forth, things you require, are going to seem cheaper, because you're not going to pay this crazy tax, which is the oligarchical tax. Now, the other side of this thing, which has another side, is that the intention of the British Queen and the intention of those throughout Europe, like the Anglo-Dutch, are the worst, or the Saudis, among the worst. So you take those groups and you put them where they belong, in jail, for example. And you do that, and you find that suddenly things cost a lot less. Now, that's not going to be a good situation. It's a good situation from the standpoint of money with respect to people. The cruelty will be lessened. The possibility of getting something going will be increased. But that means we then have to go to a driver program, a science-based driver program, to get some real production going. In other words, all we're on the verge of doing right now is simply to wipe out the swindlers. And that we are free of the tax which comes into everybody's purchasing power, the tax of the swindler tax. That does not cause growth. It does tend to improve the situation and will cause a shift of the money flow from pure swindling to some internal economy measures in Europe and the United States. But what we really need to do is to go with a fundamental reorganization of the planetary system. Now, we are dealing with the planetary system, which now has a little bit of a problem in it. Because if people don't use thermonuclear fusion, if they don't clean up the act and get serious about this stuff and stop these games they're playing, if we do that, if we make that change, then we will have a rapidly accelerating growth of productivity and naturally consumption. And this will plan, our plan is, as now, is from the Mississippi River, especially down below the Missouri Junction, which is the area which is starving for lack of water or lack of conditions of life. So we take this whole area, just below the Canadian border, and below that, into Mexico. If we put that system into work, and with the kind of water system and driver system, which goes beyond Nawapa, which goes across not only the western part of the United States and Mexico, and actually flows into Canada as well, and Alaska, but it goes into Asia. So it would be the greatest driver program that mankind has ever conceived. It'll start relatively slow in terms of rates of growth and so forth. But this means an end to that system. It means an end to the kind of political system, too, which does that sort of stuff that's been doing. It means that these guys are going to go into the poor box. They'll try to raid it, but they'll be there. They'll be taking residence there in the meantime. But the only way to understand this is just say, what is the alternative? Are you going to complain about it and say that great injustice is being perpetrated? Of course it's being perpetrated. But if you do something about it, it's not going to be perpetrated anymore. Now it's just a problem, a challenge to solve the problem. And to do that, two things. first of all, shut that thing down, shut that system down, and go back to an honest system and try to manage. The drop in costs, the actual earned costs or incurred costs, will drop the time you shut down Wall Street, and do the same thing in relevant periods of Europe, which means we get a respite, which gives us an opportunity to change these things. Then we have to do a large project, which will probably come chiefly if we can get the thermonuclear program going, thermonuclear fusion program going. And there are problems in getting it going. In principle, it will work. But you have to have the system organized to make it work in principle. In that case, mankind is headed for the greatest achievements in the coming 50 years, and along the way in those 50 years, the greatest achievements of mankind ever known. And that will solve the problem temporarily. And then we'll have to do some other things. That's the way to look at it. Let's not be playing, we got this thing that's going to hang around us. It doesn't have to be continued. It doesn't have to be the situation. And the best thing is you just simply bankrupt the British Empire, bankrupt things like it, bankrupt the swine in the United States. Swine are to be eaten, not to be enriched.